The orbital station hung in the void like a rusted trophy, a relic from wars no one remembered and alliances that had crumbled centuries ago. Station Epsilon 7 wasn't a hub of trade or diplomacy. It was a pit stop, a fuel depot, a place where the unwanted went to disappear. The corridors smelled of burnt coolant and stale recycled air, and the lighting flickered just enough to remind everyone that maintenance was always 3 cycles behind schedule. Jake Reeves didn't mind. He'd learned long ago that being forgotten had its advantages. He knelt in the lower maintenance bay, his hands black with grease, his jumpsuit torn at the knee. The plasma conduit in front of him hissed and sparked, a temperamental piece of Vrin engineering that had probably outlived its designer. Jake wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, smearing more grime across his face, and muttered a curse under his breath. "Come on, you piece of junk," he whispered, adjusting the resonance coil with a magnetic wrench. "Just hold together for another week. That's all I'm asking." The conduit responded with a low whine, then stabilized. Jake exhaled in relief. Another disaster averted. Another day survived. He stood, stretching his back, and glanced around the empty bay. The station was quiet this time of cycle, most of the crew either asleep or drinking at the cantina on Deck 4. Jake preferred it this way. Fewer eyes on him, fewer questions, fewer reminders that he was the only human on a station full of species that considered his kind an evolutionary curiosity at best and a galactic embarrassment at worst. Humans had been spacefaring for barely 2 centuries. The other species had been building empires for millennia. To them, humanity was a newcomer, a child stumbling into a room full of ancient philosophers and warlords. And Jake, he was just a mechanic, a nobody, a human who fixed things no one else wanted to touch. He grabbed his toolkit and headed for the exit, boots clanging on the metal grating. The bay door slid open with a grinding sound that made him wince. He'd have to fix that next, add it to the list. As he stepped into the corridor, a voice cut through the silence. "Reeves!" Jake stopped. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. That tone, cold and clipped, belonged to only one person on this station, Overseer Tharix. Jake turned slowly, forcing a neutral expression onto his face. Tharix stood at the end of the corridor, his forearms crossed over his broad, chitinous chest. He was Kryn, a species known for their military discipline and their disdain for anything they considered weak. His exoskeleton gleamed under the flickering lights, black and iridescent, like the shell of some predatory beetle. His eyes, multifaceted and unreadable, fixed on Jake with the kind of scrutiny reserved for insects under a microscope. "Overseer," Jake said evenly. "Something I can help you with?" Tharix's mandibles clicked together, a sound that Jake had learned to interpret as either amusement or irritation, sometimes both. "You've been assigned to a new detail," Tharix said, his voice resonating with a low mechanical buzz. "Report to Docking Bay 3 at 0600 tomorrow. You'll be joining an expedition crew." Jake blinked. "Expedition crew, sir, I'm a mechanic. I work on station systems, not—" "You work where you're assigned, Reeves," Tharix interrupted, his tone sharp. "The expedition requires a maintenance specialist, someone expendable, someone who won't be missed if things go wrong." The words hung in the air like a blade. Jake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd learned that lesson early. Pushing back against people like Tharix only made things worse. "Understood," Jake said quietly. Tharix stared at him for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Jake watched him go, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Expendable. He'd been called worse. The next morning, Jake stood in Docking Bay 3, his toolkit slung over his shoulder, his breath misting in the cold air. The bay was massive, large enough to house a dozen ships, but today it held only one, a sleek silver vessel with angular lines and glowing blue propulsion vents. It was Vrin design, elegant and deadly, the kind of ship that screamed money and power. Jake felt distinctly out of place. A ramp extended from the ship's underbelly, and figures moved around it, loading crates and running diagnostics. Most of them were Vrin, their pale, elongated bodies moving with an eerie grace. A few were Kryn, their armored forms barking orders at the crew. And then there was one figure that made Jake's stomach tighten, a Kaltorian. Jake had only seen one once before, years ago, during a trade summit that had briefly stopped at Epsilon 7. The Kaltorians were one of the oldest species in the galaxy, an empire that spanned thousands of star systems. They were tall, almost regal, with smooth grey skin that shimmered faintly in the light. Their eyes were large and entirely black, like polished obsidian, and their movements carried an unsettling stillness, as if every gesture was calculated and deliberate. This one stood near the base of the ramp, draped in flowing robes of deep crimson and gold. A translator device hung around their neck, glowing faintly. They turned as Jake approached, and their gaze swept over him with the kind of casual dismissal one might give to dirt on a boot. "You are the human," the Kaltorian said. It wasn't a question. "Jake Reeves," Jake replied, extending a hand out of habit. The Kaltorian stared at his hand, as if it were a foreign object, then turned away without acknowledging it. Jake lowered his hand slowly, his cheeks burning. "You will address me as Lord Varric," the Kaltorian said, their voice smooth and cold. "I am the expedition leader. You are here to maintain the ship's systems and ensure that nothing malfunctions during our journey. If you perform adequately, you may survive this assignment. If you do not, you will be left behind." Jake nodded, swallowing his pride. "Understood, Lord Varric." Varric gestured dismissively toward the ramp. "Board the ship. Your quarters are in the lower deck. Do not wander. Do not touch anything you are not explicitly instructed to touch, and do not speak unless spoken to." Jake bit the inside of his cheek and walked up the ramp without another word. Behind him, he heard one of the Vryn crew members laugh, a high tinkling sound that grated on his nerves. "A human mechanic," the Vryn said, just loud enough for Jake to hear. "How quaint. I wonder if he even knows which end of a wrench to hold." More laughter. Jake kept walking. The interior of the ship was as sleek as its exterior, all smooth walls and glowing panels, with corridors that curved in ways that made Jake's human sense of direction useless. He found his quarters easily enough, a small cramped room with a cot, a storage locker, and nothing else. No window, no decoration, just a box to sleep in. He dropped his toolkit on the floor and sat on the cot, running his hands through his hair. His heart was still pounding from the interaction with Lord Varric, from the laughter of the crew, from the weight of being called expendable. He'd spent his whole life being underestimated, being overlooked, being told that humans didn't belong in the stars, that they were too weak, too short-lived, too emotional, and for the most part, Jake had accepted it. He kept his head down, did his job, and tried not to think about what might have been, but sometimes in moments like this he couldn't help but wonder, what if things had been different? What if humanity had been given a fair chance? What if he had been born into a galaxy that didn't see him as a joke? He shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. There was no point in wondering. This was his reality, and right now his reality involved an expedition to some unknown planet, led by an arrogant Kaltorian who saw him as little more than a tool. Jake lay back on the cot and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, they would depart. And whatever awaited them out there, he had a feeling his life was about to get a lot more complicated. The ship launched at dawn, or what passed for dawn on a station that never saw a sun. Jake felt the hum of the engines through the walls, a deep, resonant vibration that made his teeth ache. He was in the engine room checking the plasma flow regulators when the ship broke free of the station's gravity well and leapt into the void. For a moment Jake paused, his hands stilling on the controls. He glanced at the viewport set into the far wall, a small circle of reinforced glass that showed the stars streaking past. It was beautiful, in a way that made his chest ache. Out here, in the silence of space, it was easy to forget the hierarchies and the scorn. Out here, humanity's struggles seemed small and distant, but then the intercom crackled to life, and Lord Varric's voice filled the room. "Reeves, report to the bridge." Jake sighed, wiped his hands on his jumpsuit and headed for the door. The bridge was located at the front of the ship, a wide circular room with panoramic view screens that showed the endless expanse of space. Lord Varric stood at the center, surrounded by holographic displays that flickered with data. The rest of the crew, 3 Vryn and 2 Kryn, stood at their stations, their attention fixed on their work. Jake stepped onto the bridge and waited. Varric didn't look at him. "We are approaching the Kale-Thoran system. Our destination is the 3rd planet, a world that was once home to an ancient civilization. The ruins there have been sealed for over 10,000 years. Our mission is to breach those seals and retrieve whatever artifacts remain." Jake frowned. "Sealed? You mean they were deliberately closed off?" Varric finally turned to him, and there was something cold in their black eyes. "Yes, by a species that no longer exists. The seals are of no concern. We have the technology to bypass them. And if the seals were put there for a reason," Jake asked, his voice careful, "if there's something dangerous inside?" One of the Vryn crew members laughed, the sound light and mocking. "Dangerous? To us? How adorable." Varric raised a hand, silencing the laughter. Your concern is noted, Reeves, but irrelevant. You are here to maintain the ship, not to question the expedition's purpose. Return to your duties. Jake hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Lord Varric. He turned and left the bridge, his mind churning. Something about this felt wrong. The way Varric spoke about the SEALs, the dismissive confidence of the crew, it all set off alarms in Jake's head. But what could he do? He was just a mechanic, a human, expendable. As he walked back to the engine room, he couldn't shake the feeling that this expedition was going to change everything. He just didn't know how yet. The planet Caelthoran appeared on the view screens like a bruise against the stars. Its surface was a patchwork of deep purples and blacks, with swirling clouds that glowed faintly with bioluminescence. Jake stood in the observation deck, watching as the ship descended through the atmosphere, and felt a chill run down his spine. There was something wrong about this place, something that made his instincts scream at him to turn back, but no one else seemed to notice. Or if they did, they didn't care. Lord Varric stood at the front of the deck, their hands clasped behind their back, their posture radiating calm authority. The rest of the crew moved around them, checking equipment and preparing for landing. Jake stayed near the back, trying to stay out of the way. The ship touched down with barely a tremor, the landing struts hissing as they extended and locked into place. Through the viewport, Jake could see the landscape of Caelthoran spreading out before them. Jagged rock formations that jutted up like broken teeth, valleys filled with strange, glowing mist, and in the distance, rising from the ground like a monument to something long forgotten, the ruins. They were massive, towers of black stone that spiraled into the sky, covered in carvings that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light, arches that defied geometry, curving in impossible directions. And at the center of it all, a structure that could only be described as a tomb, a pyramid of obsidian and silver, its surface etched with symbols that hurt to look at. Magnificent, Varric breathed, their voice filled with something Jake had never heard from them before. Awe. One of the Vryn crew members, a slender individual named Lys, stepped forward, their translucent skin shimmering. The seals are intact, Lord Varric. The entrance is located at the base of the central pyramid. Preliminary scans show no signs of recent activity. Good, Varric said. Prepare the breach equipment. We enter within the hour. Jake cleared his throat. Lord Varric, if I may, have the scans detected any energy signatures? Any indication of what's inside? Varric turned to him, their expression unreadable. The scans have detected nothing, which is precisely why we are here, Reeves, to discover what has been hidden for 10,000 years. But if the seals are intact, Jake pressed, doesn't that mean no one's been able to get in? Maybe there's a reason for that. Lys laughed, the sound like wind chimes. The human is frightened. How predictable. Another crew member, a Kryn named Drevik, grunted in agreement. Humans always fear what they do not understand. It is in their nature. Jake felt his face flush, but he kept his voice steady. I'm not frightened. I'm being cautious. There's a difference. Enough, Varric said sharply. Reeves, you will accompany us into the ruins. Your technical expertise may be required if we encounter any mechanisms or systems that need to be bypassed. Gather your tools and meet us at the airlock in 30 minutes. Jake wanted to argue, wanted to say that this was a bad idea, that they should take more time, run more scans, do anything other than rush headlong into a tomb that had been sealed for millennia. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Varric had made up their mind, and Jake was just the mechanic, expendable. Yes, Lord Varric, he said quietly. 30 minutes later, Jake stood at the base of the pyramid, staring up at the entrance. It was a massive archway, easily 20 feet tall, carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. The air around it felt heavy, charged with something Jake couldn't quite name. The rest of the crew moved around him, setting up equipment and preparing to breach the seals. Varric stood at the front, examining a handheld scanner, their expression focused. Lys and another Vryn were attaching devices to the archway, small disc-shaped objects that hummed with energy. Drevik and the other Kryn stood guard, their weapons at the ready. Jake tightened his grip on his toolkit and tried to ignore the knot of dread in his stomach. The seals are resonating at a frequency consistent with quantum locks, Lys said, their voice clinical. We should be able to disrupt them with a controlled energy pulse. Varric nodded. Proceed. Lys tapped a command into their wrist device, and the discs attached to the archway began to glow. The hum grew louder, rising in pitch until it was almost unbearable. Jake winced, pressing his hands to his ears, and then, with a sound like shattering glass, the seals broke. The symbols on the archway flared brightly, then went dark. The heavy, oppressive feeling in the air lifted, replaced by a sudden, yawning emptiness. The entrance, which had been sealed by an invisible barrier, now stood open, revealing a dark corridor that stretched into the depths of the pyramid. Varric stepped forward, their eyes fixed on the darkness. "Remarkable. Begin documentation." "We proceed immediately." Jake hesitated at the threshold, staring into the blackness. Every instinct he had was screaming at him not to go in, but he had no choice. He took a deep breath, adjusted the strap of his toolkit and followed the crew inside. The interior of the pyramid was cold, not the natural cold of a planet's night, but something deeper, something that seemed to seep into Jake's bones. The walls were smooth and black, lined with more of those shifting symbols. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something else, something organic and ancient. The crew moved in a tight formation, their lights cutting through the darkness. Varric led the way, their scanner held out in front of them. Liss and the other Vryn followed close behind, murmuring to each other in their native language. Drevik and the other Kryn brought up the rear, their weapons raised. Jake stayed in the middle, trying not to think about how far underground they were, how many tons of stone were above them, how easy it would be for the entrance to collapse and trap them here forever. The corridor opened into a massive chamber, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. It was a throne room, or at least it had been. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, supported by pillars carved to look like twisted trees. The floor was covered in intricate mosaics, depicting scenes of battles and ceremonies, of beings that looked almost human, but not quite. And at the far end of the chamber, rising on a dais of black stone, was a throne. It was made of the same obsidian as the pyramid, but it was inlaid with silver and gold, and at its peak a crown rested. The crown glowed faintly, pulsing with a soft golden light that illuminated the entire chamber. "By the ancients," Liss whispered, their voice filled with awe. "It's intact. After all this time, it's intact." Varric moved forward slowly, their eyes fixed on the crown. "Scan it. I want to know everything about it. Its composition, its age, its purpose." Liss pulled out a scanner and began running it over the throne. The other Vryn moved around the chamber, documenting the mosaics and carvings. Drevik and the Kryn stood at attention, watching the shadows. Jake stayed where he was, staring at the throne. There was something about it that made his skin crawl. The crown with its pulsing light seemed almost alive, and the symbols carved into the throne itself. He couldn't read them, but they felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. "Reeves," Varric called. "Come here." Jake walked forward, his boots echoing on the stone floor. Varric gestured to the base of the throne, where a series of mechanisms were visible, half hidden by centuries of dust. "There is a locking system here," Varric said. "It appears to be preventing the crown from being removed. Can you disable it?" Jake knelt down, examining the mechanisms. They were intricate, far more advanced than anything he'd seen before, but the principles were the same. Gears, levers, pressure plates. He could work with this. "I can try," Jake said, "but I need to be careful. If I trigger the wrong thing, it might—" "Do it," Varric interrupted. "We did not come all this way to leave empty-handed." Jake swallowed and reached for his tools. He worked slowly, carefully, disabling each mechanism one at a time. Sweat dripped down his forehead despite the cold. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced them steady. And then, as he was reaching for the final lever, he felt it, a tickle in his nose. No, Jake thought desperately. Not now, not here. But it was too late. The dust in the air, the ancient particles that had been disturbed by their presence, had finally reached his sinuses. He tried to hold it back, tried to breathe through his mouth, but it was no use. Jake sneezed. It was a small sneeze, barely more than a hiccup, but in the silence of the tomb, it sounded like a thunderclap. And then everything changed. The moment Jake sneezed, the symbols on the throne flared to life, glowing with a blinding golden light. The crown began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that filled the chamber. And then, with a sound like a door unlocking, the throne split apart. Jake stumbled back, his heart pounding, as the stone slabs of the throne retracted into the floor, revealing a hidden chamber beneath. Inside, resting on a pedestal of pure light, was a small, glowing orb. No, not an orb, a seed. It pulsed with the same golden light as the crown, and as Jake stared at it, he felt something stir deep inside him, something he couldn't name. Varric stepped forward, their eyes wide. "What have you done?" "I didn't," Jake stammered. "I just sneezed. I didn't touch anything." But Varric wasn't listening. They reached for the seed, their hand trembling with anticipation, and the moment their fingers touched it, the seed flared brightly, and a voice filled the chamber. It was ancient, powerful, and it spoke in a language Jake didn't recognize, but somehow he understood it. The seal is broken. The heir has returned. The bloodline is recognized. Varric jerked their hand back as if burned. The seed floated up from the pedestal, drifting through the air, and then impossibly it moved toward Jake. What? Jake tried to back away, but the seed followed him, circling around him like a curious animal. And then, before he could react, it touched his chest. There was a flash of light, blinding and searing, and Jake screamed. He felt the seed sink into his skin, felt it merge with him, felt something ancient and vast awaken inside his blood. His veins burned with golden fire, and his vision went white. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Jake collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His chest felt like it was on fire, and when he looked down, he saw it. A mark glowing on his skin, just above his heart. It was the same symbol that had been carved on the throne, the same symbol that covered the walls of the pyramid, the symbol of a crown. "No," Varric whispered, their voice filled with disbelief. "That's impossible. He's human. He can't be—" But the crown on the throne pulsed once more, and then it rose into the air, floating toward Jake. He tried to move, tried to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The crown settled onto his head, and the moment it did, the entire chamber erupted in light. Images flooded Jake's mind, memories that weren't his, a galaxy at war, a human empire that spanned the stars, a betrayal, a fall, and a promise, sealed in blood and stone, that one day the lost heir would return. Jake gasped, his mind reeling, and when the light finally faded, he found himself staring at Lord Varric. Varric's face was pale, their expression a mixture of shock and fury. "You," they whispered, "you're the lost heir. The legend was true." Jake tried to speak, but no words came. He looked around the chamber, at the crew staring at him with wide eyes, at the crown on his head, at the mark burning on his chest. And then, in a voice he barely recognized as his own, he whispered, "What have I done?" The silence in the chamber was deafening. Jake knelt on the cold stone floor, his hands pressed against his chest where the mark still burned beneath his jumpsuit. The crown sat on his head, impossibly light yet impossibly heavy, pulsing with that same golden glow that now seemed to emanate from his very skin. His mind was a storm of images and voices, memories that belonged to people who had died thousands of years before he was born, kings and queens, battles and coronations, a human empire that had stretched across the stars, commanding fleets that made the current galactic powers look like children playing with toys. And then the betrayal, the fall, the scattering of the royal bloodline across 1,000 worlds, hidden and forgotten, waiting for the day when the seals would break and the heir would return. And that heir was him, Jake Reeves, a mechanic from a forgotten orbital station, a nobody. "This can't be real," Jake whispered, his voice hoarse. "This has to be a mistake." Lord Varric took a step back, their black eyes wide with something Jake had never seen in them before. Fear. "The bloodline recognition protocol," Varric said slowly, as if speaking to themselves. "It responded to him. The crown accepted him. The legends were true. The human dynasty never truly fell. It was waiting." Lys moved forward cautiously, their scanner still in hand, their expression one of scientific fascination mixed with dread. "Lord Varric, the energy readings are off the scale. Whatever that seed was, it's integrated with his biology. His DNA has been rewritten. He's been transformed." "Transformed into what?" Drevik growled, his weapon still raised, pointed at Jake. "He's still human, still weak." "Lower your weapon," Varric commanded sharply. Drevik hesitated, then obeyed, though his eyes never left Jake. Varric approached slowly, their movements careful, measured. They stopped a few feet away, studying Jake with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Do you understand what has happened to you?" Varric asked, their voice cold, but tinged with something else. Curiosity, perhaps even respect. Jake shook his head, his throat tight. "No, I don't understand any of this. I'm just a mechanic. I fix things. I'm not—" "You are the lost heir of the House of Erin," Varric interrupted, "the last surviving member of a dynasty that once ruled over half the known galaxy. The crown has chosen you. The bloodline has awakened. Whether you understand it or not, whether you accept it or not, you are royalty." The word hit Jake like a physical blow. Royalty. He almost laughed. It was absurd, impossible. He'd spent his entire life being told he was nothing, that humans were nothing, and now he was supposed to believe he was some kind of lost king. "This is insane," Jake said, pushing himself to his feet. His legs felt unsteady, but he forced himself to stand. "There has to be another explanation. Maybe the crown malfunctioned. Maybe it's some kind of defense mechanism." "The crown does not malfunction," Varric said flatly. "It was created by the ancients, forged with technologies that we can barely comprehend. It recognizes bloodline markers at the genetic level. It cannot be fooled. It cannot make mistakes." Jake reached up, his fingers trembling, and touched the crown. It felt warm beneath his fingertips, alive, and when he tried to lift it, to remove it, it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had fused with him, become a part of him. "I can't take it off," Jake said, panic rising in his voice. "Why can't I take it off?" "Because it has claimed you," Liz said, their voice soft. "The crown binds itself to its rightful wearer. It will remain with you until you die, or until you pass it to another of the bloodline." Jake's breath came in short, sharp gasps. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a dream, a nightmare. But the weight of the crown, the burn of the mark on his chest, the memories swirling in his mind, they were all too real. "What do we do?" one of the other Vryn crew members asked, their voice uncertain. "Do we return to the ship? Contact the council?" Varric was silent for a long moment, their expression unreadable. And then, slowly, they turned to face the crew. "No one speaks of this," Varric said, their voice low and dangerous. "Not yet. We will return to the ship and we will decide how to proceed, but if word of this gets out before we are ready, the entire galaxy will descend into chaos." "Chaos?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "What do you mean?" Varric turned to him, and for the first time Jake saw something in their eyes that might have been pity. "The House of Heir was not just a human dynasty," Varric said. "It was the ruling power of the galaxy. When it fell, the vacuum it left behind led to centuries of war. The current empires, the Kaltorians, the Vryn, the Kryn, we all rose from the ashes of that collapse. We divided the galaxy among ourselves, created new borders, new alliances, and we have spent the last 10,000 years pretending that humanity was never a threat." Varric stepped closer, their voice dropping to a whisper. "But if the heir has returned, if the crown has been reclaimed, then every empire in this galaxy will have to answer a single question. Do we bow to the rightful ruler, or do we go to war to prevent the resurrection of the old order?" Jake's blood ran cold. "You're saying that because of me there could be a war?" "Not could be," Varric said quietly. "Will be, unless we find a way to control this situation." The journey back to the ship was silent. The crew moved like ghosts, their earlier confidence shattered. Jake walked at the center of the group, the crown still on his head, the mark still burning on his chest. Every step felt surreal, like he was walking through a dream he couldn't wake up from. When they reached the ship, Varric ordered the crew to their quarters and sealed the bridge. Only Jake, Varric, and Liz remained. Varric paced back and forth, their hands clasped behind their back, their expression distant. Liz stood at a console, running scans, their fingers moving rapidly over the controls. Jake sat in a chair near the viewport, staring out at the dark surface of Kyle Thoran. The crown felt heavier now, as if the weight of 10,000 years of history was pressing down on him. "I need you to explain something to me," Jake said finally, breaking the silence. "If the House of Heir was so powerful, why did it fall? What happened?" Varric stopped pacing and turned to face him. For a long moment they said nothing, and then, slowly, they spoke. "Betrayal," Varric said. "From within. The House of Heir was not destroyed by external enemies. It was destroyed by its own people, by those who believed that humanity had grown too powerful, too arrogant. They orchestrated a coup, assassinated the royal family, and scattered the bloodline to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. And then they erased the records, rewrote history, made sure that future generations would never know what humanity had once been." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Who were they? The ones who betrayed the house?" "We do not know," Varric admitted. "The records were destroyed. The conspirators hid their identities well. But what we do know is that they succeeded. The House of Heir fell, and humanity was reduced to what it is today, a scattered, powerless species that most of the galaxy has forgotten. Until now," Liz said quietly, looking up from their console, "until the heir returned." Jake closed his eyes, his head spinning. This was too much, too big. He was just a mechanic. He didn't know how to rule. He didn't know how to lead. He didn't even know how to survive in a galaxy that suddenly saw him as both a savior and a threat. "What am I supposed to do?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be a king. I don't know anything about ruling an empire." Varric was silent for a moment, and then, surprisingly, they knelt. It was a slow, deliberate motion, and when they lowered their head, Jake's breath caught in his throat. "You are the heir," Varric said quietly. "Whether you are ready or not, the crown has chosen you, and that means you have a duty, not to me, not to the galaxy, but to your people, to humanity." Jake stared at Varric, his mind racing. He wanted to argue, to refuse, to run, but he couldn't, because deep down beneath the fear and the confusion he felt something else, a pull, a connection, to the crown, to the mark on his chest, to the memories that weren't his but somehow were. The House of Heir had fallen, but it had never truly died, and now, against all odds, it had returned. 3 days later, the ship arrived back at Station Epsilon 7. Jake stood in his quarters, staring at his reflection in the small mirror mounted on the wall. The crown was gone. Varric had somehow managed to make it disappear, to hide it within some kind of subspace pocket, but the mark on his chest remained, glowing faintly beneath his skin. He looked the same. Still, Jake Reeves, the mechanic. Still nobody. But he didn't feel the same. Varric had spent the last 3 days teaching him. Not everything, there wasn't enough time for that, but the basics. The history of the House of Heir, the structure of the old empire, the alliances and the enemies, the protocols and the traditions, and most importantly, the danger. "The moment word of your existence spreads," Varric had told him, "you will become the most hunted person in the galaxy. There are empires that will want to use you, empires that will want to kill you, and empires that will want to control you. You cannot trust anyone, not even you," Jake had asked. Varric had smiled, a cold, humorless expression. "Especially not me." Now, as Jake prepared to disembark, he felt the weight of that warning pressing down on him. He pulled on his jacket, hiding the mark, and grabbed his toolkit. For now, he would return to his life, return to being a mechanic. But he knew it was only a matter of time before everything changed. He stepped out of his quarters and made his way to the airlock. Varric was waiting there, their expression unreadable. "Remember," Varric said quietly, "tell no one, trust no one, and if you value your life, stay hidden. The galaxy is not ready for your return." Jake nodded, his throat tight. "What about you? What are you going to do?" Varric's eyes glittered. "I am going to do what I have always done. Serve the interests of my people, and right now those interests align with keeping you alive for now." Jake didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply turned and walked down the ramp, back onto the station. The air smelled the same. The corridors looked the same. Everything was the same, except him. As Jake walked toward his quarters, he felt eyes on him. Not from the crew, they didn't know, but from something else, something deeper. The mark on his chest pulsed, as if responding to an unseen presence. And in that moment, Jake understood. The galaxy had changed the moment he sneezed in that tomb, and there was no going back. Life on Station Epsilon 7 resumed its normal rhythm, but for Jake, nothing felt normal anymore. He returned to his duties in the maintenance bay, crawling through conduits and repairing plasma relays as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The mark on his chest pulsed with a steady warmth, a constant reminder of what he'd become. And the memories, fragments of lives lived thousands of years ago, haunted his dreams. Kings on thrones, fleets burning in the void, a voice whispering in a language he shouldn't understand. "Remember who you are." Jake tried to push it all away, tried to be invisible again. But invisibility was no longer possible. He noticed it first in the way people looked at him. Not everyone. Most of the station's inhabitants ignored him as they always had. But there were others. Crew members who lingered too long in doorways when he passed. Dock workers who watched him from the shadows. Once he caught a Vryn merchant staring at him across the cantina, their translucent face expressionless, but their eyes sharp and calculating. Jake kept his head down and his mouth shut. Varric's warning echoed in his mind. Trust no one. But staying hidden proved harder than he'd hoped. It started with the messages. The first one appeared on his datapad 3 days after his return. Jake had been in his quarters, exhausted after a 12-hour shift, when the device beeped. He picked it up, expecting a work order or a shift change notification. Instead, he saw a single line of text, written in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. "The blood remembers. The crown calls. You cannot hide forever." Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. He deleted the message immediately, his heart pounding. A glitch, he told himself. A random spam message. Nothing more. But the next day, another message came. And the day after that, another. They are watching. The old enemies are stirring. Return to us, heir of Erin, before it is too late. Jake stopped sleeping. He started checking over his shoulder constantly, jumping at every shadow, every unexpected sound. He ran diagnostics on his datapad, but found no trace of how the messages were getting through. No sender, no origin point. They simply appeared, as if conjured from the air itself. He considered going to Varric, but stopped himself. Varric had made it clear their alliance was one of convenience, not loyalty. And besides, what could Varric do? The messages weren't threatening, they were warnings. But warnings from whom? On the 7th day, the messages stopped. And that's when the attacks began. Jake was in the lower maintenance bay alone, working on a faulty coolant pump. The station was quiet, most of the crew on their rest cycle. The only sounds were the hum of the machinery and the occasional hiss of pressurized gas. He didn't hear the footsteps until it was almost too late. Jake turned just as a figure lunged out of the shadows, a blade glinting in the dim light. Instinct took over. Jake threw himself to the side, the blade missing his throat by inches. He hit the ground hard, his toolkit scattering across the floor. The attacker was fast. They didn't pause, didn't hesitate. They came at Jake again, the blade slashing downward. Jake rolled, his hand closing around a heavy wrench from his scattered tools. He swung it wildly and by sheer luck connected with the attacker's wrist. The blade clattered to the floor. Jake scrambled to his feet, the wrench raised defensively. In the poor light he could barely make out the attacker's features. They were humanoid, but their face was covered by a dark mask, their body wrapped in form-fitting armor that absorbed the light. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, his voice shaking. "What do you want?" The attacker didn't answer. They reached for something at their belt, and Jake saw the glint of another weapon. Panic surged through him. He wasn't a fighter. He was a mechanic. He had no idea how to survive this. But then something inside him shifted. The mark on his chest flared with sudden heat, and Jake gasped as a surge of energy coursed through his body. His vision sharpened, his muscles tensed, and suddenly he could see the attacker's movements before they happened. The slight shift of weight, the tension in their shoulders, the trajectory of their strike. Jake moved without thinking. He ducked under the attacker's arm, grabbed their wrist and twisted. The attacker grunted in pain and stumbled backward. Jake followed, driven by an instinct he didn't understand, and slammed the wrench into the side of their head. The attacker collapsed, unconscious. Jake stood there, breathing hard, staring down at the figure on the floor. His hands were shaking, the wrench slipping from his grip. The mark on his chest still burned, but the heat was fading, leaving him cold and confused. What just happened? Before he could process it, the bay door hissed open, and Overseer Tharix strode in, flanked by 2 station security officers. Tharix's multifaceted eyes fixed on Jake, then on the unconscious attacker. "Reeves," Tharix said slowly, his mandibles clicking. "Explain." Jake was taken to a security station and questioned for 3 hours. He told them the truth, or most of it. He'd been attacked. He'd defended himself. He didn't know who the attacker was, or why they'd come after him. Tharix didn't look convinced, but without evidence to the contrary. They had no choice but to release him. The attacker, once they regained consciousness, refused to speak. They had no identification, no datapad, nothing that could reveal their identity or their purpose. "You're lucky you survived," Tharix said, as Jake was escorted out of the security station. "But luck doesn't last forever, Reeves. If someone is targeting you, they will try again. And next time you may not be so fortunate." Jake nodded mutely and left. He returned to his quarters, locked the door, and collapsed onto his cot. His body ached, and his mind was a mess of fear and confusion. Someone had tried to kill him, and if Tharix was right, they would try again. But why? He was nobody. A mechanic. Unless someone knew. The thought made his blood run cold. Had word of the crown leaked? Had someone discovered what happened on Kael Thorin? Varric had promised secrecy, but promises meant nothing in a galaxy built on betrayal. Jake pulled off his shirt and stared at the mark on his chest. It glowed faintly in the darkness, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He pressed his hand against it, feeling the warmth beneath his skin. "What do you want from me?" he whispered to the empty room. The mark didn't answer. But in the silence that followed, Jake heard it again, that voice ancient and distant echoing from the depths of his mind. Remember who you are. The next morning, Jake received a summons. Not from Tharix, not from Station Command, from Lord Varric. The message was brief and to the point. Come to Docking Bay 3 immediately. Tell no one. Jake's stomach churned as he made his way through the station. The corridors felt different now, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching him. He kept his hand close to the small plasma cutter he'd started carrying in his pocket. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. When he reached the docking bay, Varric's ship was waiting, its ramp extended. Jake hesitated at the threshold, then climbed aboard. Varric was waiting in the main hold, their expression grave. Liz stood beside them, their scanner in hand, their translucent skin shimmering with agitation. "You were attacked," Varric said without preamble. It wasn't a question. Jake nodded. "How did you know?" "Because I have been monitoring station communications," Varric said, "and because the attacker was not random. They were sent by the Kryn High Council." Jake's breath caught. "The Kryn? Why would they—" "Because they know," Liz interrupted, their voice tight. "Someone leaked information about Kael Thoran, about the Crown, about you." Jake felt the floor drop out from under him. "How? You said no one would know. You said—" "I said we would keep it secret," Varric cut him off sharply. "But secrets have a way of escaping, especially when they are as valuable as this one. Someone on my crew spoke. And now the Kryn know that the lost heir has returned, and they want me dead," Jake said quietly. "Not just the Kryn," Varric said. "The Vryn Council has also been made aware, and the Kaltorian Imperium. Within days, every major power in the galaxy will know your name, and they will all come for you." Jake's legs felt weak. He sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands. "So what do I do? Where do I go? I can't fight an entire galaxy." "No," Varric agreed. "You cannot, but you do not have to fight alone." Jake looked up. "What do you mean?" Varric exchanged a glance with Liz, then turned back to Jake. "There are others, remnants of the old empire, loyal houses that never forgot the bloodline. They have been waiting, scattered across the galaxy, for the day the heir would return. If we can find them, if we can unite them, you will have an army." "An army?" Jake repeated, the word foreign on his tongue. "I don't want an army. I don't want any of this." "What you want is irrelevant," Varric said coldly. "What matters is survival. And right now your only chance of survival is to embrace what you are, to claim your birthright, to become the king the galaxy fears." Jake shook his head, his chest tight. "I'm not a king. I'm a mechanic. I fix things. I don't—" "You are the heir of Erin," Varric interrupted, their voice sharp. "And whether you accept it or not, the galaxy has already made its decision. You are a threat, and threats are eliminated." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jake closed his eyes, his mind racing. He thought of his quiet life on the station, his small quarters, his simple work, all of it gone now, shattered by a single sneeze in a forgotten tomb. But he couldn't go back. He knew that now. The galaxy had changed, and so had he. "All right," Jake said finally, his voice steady. "If I'm going to survive this, I need to know everything. No more secrets, no more half-truths. I need to know who I am, what the House of Erin was, and who my enemies are." Varric nodded slowly. "Then we begin your education. But know this, Jake Reeves, once you step onto this path there is no turning back. You will be hunted, betrayed, tested, and if you survive, you will either become the king this galaxy needs, or the tyrant it fears." Jake met Varric's gaze, and for the first time since the Crown had chosen him, he felt something other than fear. He felt resolve. "Then let's get started," Jake said. And with those words, the lost heir of Erin took his first step toward reclaiming a legacy 10,000 years in the making. Varric's ship departed Station Epsilon 7 under the cover of darkness, its signature masked by stealth technology that Jake didn't fully understand. He sat in the small observation lounge watching the stars blur into lines as the ship jumped into hyperspace, leaving behind the only home he'd known for the past 5 years. He should have felt something. Sadness, maybe. Regret. But all he felt was numb. Liz entered the lounge carrying a data pad, their movements precise and graceful. They sat across from Jake, their large eyes studying him with clinical interest. "Lord Varric has instructed me to begin your instruction," Liz said. "We have a 3-day journey ahead of us. That gives us time to cover the basics." Jake rubbed his face, exhaustion settling into his bones. "The basics of what? Being a king?" The basics of staying alive, Liz corrected, which, given your current circumstances, is considerably more important. They activated the data pad, and a holographic display materialized in the air between them. It showed a map of the galaxy, vast and intricate, with countless star systems connected by glowing lines. This is the galaxy as it exists today, Liz said, divided among 7 major empires: the Kaltorian Imperium, which Lord Varric represents, the Vryn Collective, the Kryn Dominion, the Solth Federation, the Torvin Sovereignty, the Geth Protectorate, and the Human Confederacy. Jake leaned forward, studying the map. The Human Confederacy occupied a small cluster of systems near the outer rim, dwarfed by the territories of the other empires. "We're so small," Jake said quietly. "Now, yes," Liz agreed. "But 10,000 years ago, humanity controlled this." The map shifted, and Jake's breath caught. The human territory expanded across the hologram, covering nearly half the galaxy. Thousands of star systems, connected by a web of trade routes and military installations. At the center, a single system glowed brighter than the rest. Erinthar, Liz said, the crown jewel of the House of Erin, the capital of human civilization. It was said to be the most beautiful world in the galaxy, cities that touched the clouds, oceans that shimmered with bioluminescent life, and at its heart, the eternal palace, where your ancestors ruled. "What happened to it?" Jake asked. Lys's expression darkened. "It was destroyed. During the fall, the conspirators unleashed a weapon, something ancient and terrible. Erinthar burned for 100 years. The planet is still there, but it is dead, a monument to what was lost." Jake stared at the map, at the ghost of an empire that had once been his birthright. It felt impossible, unreal. How could he be connected to something so vast, so distant? "Who were they?" Jake asked. "The conspirators. The ones who destroyed everything." "We do not know their names," Liz said, "but we know they were human. Members of the royal court who believed the empire had become corrupt, that humanity's reach had exceeded its grasp. They called themselves the Ashes of Tyranny, and they succeeded in their goal. They erased the House of Erin from history." "Except they didn't," Jake said quietly. "Because I'm here." "Yes," Liz said, "because you are here. And that terrifies every empire in this galaxy." Over the next 3 days, Liz taught Jake everything they could: the history of the House of Erin, the structure of the old empire, the names of the royal houses that had served under the crown, the House of Thalos, warriors and protectors, the House of Vane, scholars and engineers, the House of Calith, diplomats and negotiators. Most of them had been wiped out during the fall, but Liz believed that some had survived, hidden in the far reaches of the galaxy, waiting for the day the heir would return. "Our destination is one such place," Liz explained, "a system called Valtharis. It was once a military stronghold of the House of Thalos. If any of the old loyalists survived, they would be there. And if they're not?" Jake asked. "Then we find another lead," Liz said simply, "and another, until we have enough forces to protect you." Jake wanted to argue, to say that he didn't need an army, that he just wanted to go back to his quiet life, but he knew it was pointless. That life was gone, and the sooner he accepted that, the better his chances of survival. Varric joined them on the second day, and their lessons took on a darker tone. Varric taught Jake about the politics of the galaxy, the alliances and rivalries, the treaties and betrayals. They explained how the current empires had risen from the ashes of the human collapse, how they had divided the galaxy among themselves and created a fragile peace that could shatter at any moment. "And now you threaten that peace," Varric said, their black eyes fixed on Jake. "Because if the heir of Erin reclaims the throne, it calls into question the legitimacy of every empire that exists today. The Kaltorians, the Vryn, the Kryn, we all built our power on the ruins of your ancestors' empire. If you rise, we fall. So why are you helping me?" Jake asked. "If I'm such a threat to your people, why not just kill me and be done with it?" Varric smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "Because I am a pragmatist. If you are going to rise, I would rather be your ally than your enemy. And if you are going to fall, I would rather be the one to control how that fall happens." Jake didn't know whether to feel grateful or terrified, probably both. On the third day they arrived at Valtharis. The system was remote, tucked into a nebula that glowed with shades of crimson and violet. The planet itself was small and grey, its surface scarred by ancient battles. But it wasn't the planet that caught Jake's attention. It was the fleet. Dozens of ships floated in orbit, their hulls dark and silent. They were human designs, angular and brutal, built for war. But they were old, ancient even, covered in layers of dust and debris, ghost ships forgotten by time. By the ancients, Lys whispered, their voice filled with awe. They're still here, the lost fleet of Thalos. Varric leaned forward, their eyes narrowing. Can they still function? Only one way to find out, Lys said, already pulling up scans. Jake stared at the fleet, his chest tight. These ships had once belonged to his ancestors, had once defended the Empire. And now they floated here, abandoned and forgotten, waiting for someone to claim them, waiting for him. Bring us closer, Varric ordered. The ship moved toward the largest vessel in the fleet, a massive dreadnought that dwarfed everything around it. Its hull was scarred and pitted, but it still radiated a sense of power, of menace. There's a docking port on the starboard side, Lys said. It appears to be intact. Then we board, Varric said. The interior of the dreadnought was cold and dark, lit only by the beams of their handheld lights. The air smelled stale, and Jake's breath misted in front of him as they made their way down the main corridor. The walls were lined with carvings, images of battles and ceremonies of kings and warriors. Jake recognized some of the symbols from the memories the crown had given him. This ship had been a flagship, a symbol of the House of Thalos's strength. The bridge should be this way, Lys said, consulting their scanner. They moved through the ship, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the ship itself was aware of their presence. Finally, they reached the bridge. It was massive, with a panoramic viewport that showed the stars beyond. Command stations lined the walls, their screens dark and lifeless. And at the center, raised on a small dais, was the captain's chair. No, not just a captain's chair, a throne. Jake approached slowly, his heart pounding. The throne was made of black metal inlaid with gold and silver, and above it, carved into the wall, was a symbol he recognized. The crown of Heir. This was a royal vessel, Varric said quietly, built for the heir to command. Jake reached out, his fingers brushing against the armrest of the throne, and the moment he touched it, the ship came alive. Lights flickered on across the bridge. Screens blazed to life, displaying data in a language Jake didn't recognize but somehow understood. The hum of power filled the air, and the ship shuddered as its systems awakened. Impossible, Lys breathed. The ship's core should be dead. It's been dormant for 10,000 years. But Jake understood. The ship hadn't been waiting for just anyone. It had been waiting for him. A voice echoed through the bridge, synthetic and cold. Bloodline recognized. Welcome, Heir of Heir. The fleet awaits your command. Jake stared at the throne, at the screens showing the other ships in the fleet coming to life, their engines igniting, their weapons powering up. He had an army now, a fleet, the tools to fight back. But the weight of it all pressed down on him like a physical force. This wasn't just a gift, it was a responsibility, a burden, and he didn't know if he was strong enough to carry it. Varric stepped forward, their expression unreadable. You have a choice now, Jake Reeves. You can turn back, abandon the crown, destroy the fleet and disappear into the galaxy. Live the rest of your life as a nobody. Jake looked at Varric, then at the throne, then at the viewport showing the awakened fleet. Or, Jake asked, or you sit on that throne, Varric said, and you become the king this galaxy fears. Jake closed his eyes, the mark on his chest burning, and then, slowly, he sat down. The throne recognized him instantly. Energy surged through his body, connecting him to the ship, to the fleet, to the legacy of the House of Heir, and in that moment, Jake Reeves, the mechanic, the nobody, became something more. He became the heir. Set course for the outer rim, Jake said, his voice steady. We're going to find the rest of the loyalists, and then we're going to take back what's ours. Varric smiled. As you command, my king. And the lost fleet of Thalos roared to life. The fleet moved through the void like a predator, stirring from a long slumber. 57 ships in total, ranging from sleek frigates to massive dreadnoughts, all bearing the mark of the House of Heir. They had been silent for 10 millennia, waiting in the darkness of Valtheris. Now, with Jake sitting on the throne of the flagship Eternal Vigil, they were alive again. But alive didn't mean ready. Jake stood on the bridge of the Vigil, staring at the cascade of damage reports scrolling across the screens. Hull breaches, failing life support systems, weapons platforms that hadn't been calibrated in thousands of years. The fleet was functional, but barely. It would take weeks, maybe months, to bring it back to full combat readiness, and they didn't have months. Lord Varric, Liz said, their voice tight as they studied their scanner. I'm detecting multiple hyperspace signatures on the edge of the system. They're converging on our position. Varric moved to Liss's station, their expression darkening. How many? 15 vessels. Kryn design. Battle cruisers. Jake's stomach dropped. They found us already? The moment the fleet powered up, it sent out a signature that could be detected across half the sector, Varric said grimly. We should have anticipated this. Can we fight them? Jake asked, his hands gripping the armrests of the throne. Liz shook their head. Not in our current condition. We have numbers, but most of our systems are still coming online. The Kryn fleet is fresh and fully armed. If they engage us now, we'll be destroyed. Jake's mind raced. He'd only been sitting on this throne for a few hours, and already he was facing annihilation. The weight of command pressed down on him, suffocating. What are our options? Jake asked, forcing his voice to stay steady. We run, Varric said bluntly. Jump to hyperspace before they get within firing range. Regroup somewhere safer. And if they follow us? Jake asked. Then we keep running until we can find allies, Varric said, or until they catch us. Jake closed his eyes, the mark on his chest burning. He could feel the fleet around him, connected to him through the throne, waiting for his command. 57 ships. Thousands of lives, even if most of those lives were automated systems, and all of it rested on his shoulders. He thought of his father, a man who had worked on Earth's colony ships, who had taught Jake that sometimes the best way to fix something broken was to understand what it needed. Not what you wanted it to be, but what it needed to survive. The fleet didn't need a warrior king. Not yet. It needed time. Prepare for jump, Jake said. Set course for the outer reach. And send a wide-spectrum broadcast on all frequencies. Tell anyone listening that the heir of Erin has returned. Tell them where to find us. Varric's eyes widened. That will bring every bounty hunter and assassin in the galaxy down on us. It will also bring the loyalists, Jake said. If there are any left, they'll hear the call, and we need them. Varric stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. As you command. The jump to the outer reach took 6 hours. The outer reach was a region of space on the galaxy's edge, far from the established trade routes and the watchful eyes of the major empires. It was lawless territory, home to pirates, refugees, and those who wanted to disappear. It was the perfect place to hide, and the perfect place to gather an army. The fleet emerged from hyperspace near a dying star, its red light casting eerie shadows across the hulls of the ships. Jake had chosen this location deliberately. It was a navigational nightmare full of radiation and debris fields that made scanning difficult. Any pursuers would have trouble finding them here. The Kryn fleet is no longer on our sensors, Liz reported. It appears we've lost them. For now. Jake exhaled in relief, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. They'd bought themselves time, but not much. The Kryn would find them eventually, and when they did, Jake needed to be ready. Begin repairs immediately, Jake ordered. Prioritize weapons systems and shields. I want this fleet combat-ready within the week. That's an ambitious timeline, Liz said. Most of our engineering staff are automated drones. They can handle basic repairs, but anything complex will require a mechanic, Jake finished. He stood from the throne, rolling his shoulders. Which, lucky for us, is exactly what I am. Show me the worst damage. I'll start there. Varric raised an eyebrow. You intend to repair the fleet yourself? I intend to help, Jake said. I'm not going to sit on this throne and watch while everyone else does the work. If we're going to survive, we all need to contribute. For the first time since they'd met, Jake saw something in Varric's expression that might have been respect. Very well, Varric said, but you will take an escort. There are still too many unknowns in this fleet. It may not be safe. Jake wanted to argue, but he knew Varric was right. He nodded and followed Liz toward the engineering deck. The engineering deck was a maze of conduits and machinery, all humming with barely contained energy. Jake felt at home here in a way he didn't on the bridge. This was his world. Tools and wires and systems that could be fixed with patience and skill. He spent the next 3 days working alongside the repair drones, crawling through access tunnels and rewiring power junctions. It was exhausting, grueling work, but it kept his mind occupied, and slowly the fleet began to heal. On the 4th day, the first response to his broadcast arrived. Jake was in the main cargo bay, welding a plasma coupling, when Varric's voice echoed over the intercom. Reeves, report to the bridge immediately. Jake set down his tools and ran. When he reached the bridge, he found Varric and Liz standing at the main view screen, staring at a small vessel that had just emerged from hyperspace. It was human design, old but well-maintained, with markings that Jake recognized from the memories the crown had given him, the crest of the House of Vane. "They responded," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They did," Varric confirmed, "and they're requesting permission to dock." Jake's heart pounded. This was it. The moment everything became real. If there were loyalists still out there, still waiting, this was proof. "Grant permission," Jake said, "and prepare a welcoming party. We're about to meet our first allies." The airlock cycled open, and a figure stepped through. They were human, tall and lean, with silver hair tied back in a braid and eyes that gleamed with intelligence. They wore robes of deep blue, embroidered with the symbols of the House of Vane, and they carried themselves with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime serving royalty. They stopped at the entrance to the docking bay, their eyes scanning the assembled group. When their gaze landed on Jake, they went very still. Slowly, deliberately, they knelt. "Heir of Erin," they said, their voice steady and reverent. "I am Serath Vane, last of the House of Vane. My family has waited 10,000 years for this moment. I offer you my loyalty, my knowledge, and my life." Jake stared at them, his throat tight. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to someone kneeling before him, pledging their life to a legacy he still didn't fully understand. But he knew what his father would have said. When someone offers you their trust, you honor it. Jake stepped forward and placed a hand on Serath's shoulder. "Stand up, please." Serath looked up, their eyes wide with surprise. "My lord?" "I'm not your lord," Jake said quietly. "I'm just a man trying to survive, and I need allies, not servants. Will you stand with me?" Serath's expression softened, and they rose to their feet. "I will, and I'm not alone. There are others, scattered across the galaxy, families who remember, families who have waited. If you call them, they will come." Jake felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. "Then help me call them. Help me gather an army, because we're going to need one." Serath nodded. "It will be my honor." Over the next 2 weeks, more ships arrived. Some were small, carrying only a handful of people. Others were larger, transports filled with soldiers and engineers, supplies and weapons. They came from all corners of the galaxy, drawn by Jake's broadcast, by the promise that the House of Erin had returned. And with each arrival, Jake's understanding of his role deepened. He met warriors from the House of Thalos, grizzled veterans who had spent their lives training for a war they thought would never come. He met scholars from the House of Vane, keepers of ancient knowledge who had preserved the history of the Empire in hidden archives. He met diplomats from the House of Calith, who spoke of alliances that could be rekindled and treaties that could be honored. And he met ordinary people, farmers and merchants, mechanics and medics, humans who had lived their entire lives under the shadow of the other empires, who had been told they were weak, inferior, disposable, and now, for the first time, they had hope. Jake spoke with them all, listened to their stories, learned their names, and with each conversation he felt the weight of the crown grow heavier, but also more bearable. He wasn't just carrying the legacy of the House of Erin. He was carrying the hopes of every human in the galaxy who had ever been told they didn't matter, and he refused to let them down. But hope alone wouldn't save them. On the 15th day, Lys detected another fleet approaching. This one was larger, more organized, and it wasn't responding to hails. "Kaltorian Imperium," Varric said, their voice grim. A full battle group, 30 ships, heavily armed. Jake stood on the bridge, staring at the incoming signatures on the screen. The repairs were complete, the fleet was ready, and their numbers had swelled to nearly 100 ships with the arrival of the Loyalists. But the Kaltorians were an empire. They had resources, experience, and a reputation for ruthlessness. "They're not here to negotiate," Varric said quietly. "They're here to destroy you." Jake's hands tightened on the armrests of the throne. He thought of all the people who had come to him, the warriors and scholars, the farmers and mechanics, all of them trusting him to lead them. He couldn't let them die, but he also couldn't run forever. "Open a channel," Jake said. Varric hesitated. "Are you certain?" "Open it," Jake repeated, his voice firm. The view screen flickered and a face appeared. It was Kaltorian, their grey skin smooth and expressionless, their black eyes cold. They wore the uniform of a fleet admiral, adorned with medals and insignia that spoke of countless victories. "I am Admiral Kaith of the Kaltorian Imperium," they said, their voice devoid of emotion. "You are harboring the fugitive known as Jake Reeves, the false heir. Surrender him immediately, or we will destroy your fleet." Jake stepped forward, into the view of the camera. I am Jake Reeves, and I'm not a fugitive. I'm the rightful heir of the House of Erin. This fleet is mine. These people are mine. And if you want them, you'll have to go through me." Kaith's expression didn't change, but Jake saw a flicker of something in their eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. "You are a mechanic," Kaith said. "A nobody. You have no right to that crown." "The crown chose me," Jake said, "and that's the only right I need. So I'm giving you a choice, Admiral. Turn your fleet around and leave, or stay and find out what happens when you challenge the heir of Erin." The channel went silent. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. And then Admiral Kaith smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression. "Very well," Kaith said. "Let us see if the lost heir is worthy of his name." The channel closed, and the Kaltorian fleet opened fire. The first salvo tore through space like a storm of fire. Jake felt it before he saw it, a surge of alarm through the neural connection to the throne, as the fleet's sensors screamed warnings. The view screen erupted with light, as plasma bolts and missile contrails streaked toward his ships, brilliant and deadly against the darkness. "Evasive maneuvers!" Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos on the bridge. "All ships, scatter formation Delta. Frigates to the flanks, dreadnoughts hold the center." The fleet responded instantly, decades of automated protocols combining with the instructions of veteran crews. The ships broke apart like a flock of birds, weaving through the incoming fire with grace that belied their age and size. But not all of them were fast enough. Jake watched in horror as one of the smaller vessels, a transport that had arrived just 3 days ago, carrying families from a mining colony, took a direct hit. Its shields flared, collapsed, and then the hull ruptured in a blossom of flame and debris. 43 souls, gone in an instant. "Return fire," Jake commanded, his jaw clenched. "Target their forward cruisers. Focus fire one ship at a time. We can't afford to waste ammunition." The Eternal Vigil shuddered as its main guns came online, massive energy cannons that hummed with barely contained power. Beams of concentrated plasma lanced across the void, converging on the lead Kaltorian cruiser. Its shields held for a moment, flickering and sparking, then collapsed. The second volley punched through the hull, and the cruiser went dark, tumbling through space like a dying star. "First kill confirmed," Liss reported, their voice tight with adrenaline, "but they're adapting, adjusting their shield frequencies to compensate." Varric stood at Jake's side, their black eyes fixed on the tactical display. "The Kaltorians are testing us. They want to see how you fight, how you think. Admiral Kaith is one of their best strategists. They won't commit their full force until they understand your tactics." Jake's mind raced. He'd never commanded a fleet before, never led anyone into battle, but he'd spent years fixing machines, understanding how systems work together, how one failure could cascade into disaster, or how one clever adjustment could turn everything around. A fleet wasn't so different. Each ship was a component, each decision was a connection, and right now, he needed to make sure those connections held. "Serath," Jake called to the silver-haired scholar who had taken a position at one of the auxiliary stations. "What do we know about Kaltorian battle doctrine?" Serath looked up from their console, their expression sharp. "They favor overwhelming firepower and rigid formations. They're disciplined but inflexible. They expect their enemies to fight traditionally, ship to ship, line against line." "Then we don't fight traditionally," Jake said. A plan was forming in his mind, reckless and desperate, but it was all he had. "Liz, can we use the radiation from the dying star, create interference that disrupts their targeting systems?" Liz's translucent skin shimmered as they worked their scanner. "Possibly. If we position the fleet closer to the stellar corona, the radiation output would interfere with long-range sensors, but it would also affect our systems." "Not if we recalibrate our shields to filter the specific wavelengths," Jake said, his mechanics instincts taking over. "We're using older technology. It's analog, hardened against electromagnetic interference. Their ships are newer, more sophisticated. That makes them vulnerable to this kind of disruption." Varric's mandibles clicked in what might have been approval. "A clever gambit, but it requires precision. One miscalculation, and we'll fry our own systems." "Then we don't miscalculate," Jake said. He turned to the bridge crew, his voice rising. "All ships, adjust course. We're moving toward the star. Reduce shield power to forward sections only. Divert everything else to radiation filtering. And somebody get me a firing solution on their flagship." The fleet turned as one, diving toward the dying red star. The temperature readings on the bridge began to climb, and Jake could feel sweat beading on his forehead. The hull groaned as they pushed deeper into the radiation field, the very air around them seeming to shimmer with heat. The Kaltorian fleet followed, their formation tightening as they attempted to maintain their targeting locks. But the interference was already taking effect. Their shots went wide, missing by meters, then tens of meters, their targeting computers struggling to compensate. "Now!" Jake shouted. "All dreadnoughts full broadside. Pour everything into their flagship." The Eternal Vigil and the 3 other dreadnoughts unleashed hell. Energy beams, kinetic rounds and missile barrages converged on Admiral Kaith's command ship, a massive vessel that dwarfed everything else in the Kaltorian fleet. Its shields flared brilliantly, absorbing the punishment, but Jake could see them weakening, the light growing dimmer with each impact. "Their shields are at 60%, Liss reported. 50, 40. "Keep firing," Jake commanded. And then, in a moment of perfect coordination that Jake would later realize was pure luck combined with desperation, one of the smaller frigates, commanded by a veteran from the House of Thalos, launched a spread of torpedoes directly into the flagship's weakened shield grid. The torpedoes struck home. The shields collapsed entirely, and the explosions tore through the flagship's hull, ripping open its command deck. Secondary explosions bloomed across its surface, and then the entire forward section broke away, tumbling into the radiation field where it was consumed by the star's corona. "Flagship destroyed!" someone shouted, and the bridge erupted in cheers. But Jake didn't celebrate. He watched the tactical display as the Kaltorian fleet faltered, their formation breaking apart in confusion. Without their admiral, without clear orders, they were vulnerable. This was the moment, the turning point, and Jake knew he had to press the advantage. "All ships advance," Jake ordered. "Break their formation, don't give them time to regroup." The Loyalist fleet surged forward, their guns blazing. The Kaltorians, still reeling from the loss of their command ship, tried to mount a defense, but it was too late. One by one, their vessels were picked apart, destroyed or forced to retreat. Within 20 minutes, the battle was over. Jake stood on the bridge of the Eternal Vigil, staring at the debris field floating in the void. Twisted metal, bodies frozen in the vacuum, the remains of ships that had been alive with crew just an hour ago. He'd won, but the victory felt hollow. "Casualty report," Jake said quietly. Liss consulted their scanner, their expression somber. 7 ships lost, 3 damaged beyond immediate repair. Estimated casualties, 412. 412. Jake closed his eyes, his chest tight. 412 people who had trusted him, who had followed him into battle, and now they were gone. "We did what we had to do," Varric said, their voice low. "They gave us no choice." "I know," Jake whispered, "but that doesn't make it easier." The fleet limped to a nearby asteroid field to make repairs and tend to the wounded. Jake moved through the ships, visiting the injured, speaking with the crews, listening to their stories. He attended the memorials for the dead, standing in silence as their names were read aloud and their bodies committed to the void. And with each name, with each face, Jake felt the weight of the crown grow heavier. This was what it meant to be a king. Not glory or power, but responsibility. The knowledge that every decision he made would ripple outward, affecting thousands of lives, and that some of those decisions would end in death. On the 3rd day after the battle, Serath approached him in the observation lounge where Jake had gone to be alone. The scholar sat down across from him, their silver hair catching the light. "You carry their deaths with you," Serath said gently. "I can see it." Jake nodded, unable to speak. "Good," Serath said. "That means you understand the cost of leadership. A king who does not mourn his people is not worthy of the crown." "I'm not a king," Jake said, his voice hoarse. "I'm just a mechanic who got lucky. Or unlucky, I don't know which." "You are more than that," Serath said. "The crown chose you for a reason, and in the past weeks, I have watched you earn the loyalty of these people, not through birthright, but through your actions. You work beside them, you listen to them, you fight for them. That is what makes a true king." Jake looked up, meeting Serath's gaze. "What if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail them?" "Then you fail," Serath said simply. "But you will fail trying, and that is more than most rulers can say." They paused, then added, "The House of Erin did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it forgot what it meant to serve. You have not forgotten, and as long as you remember, you will not fail." Jake wanted to believe that, wanted to have that kind of faith in himself, but all he could see were the faces of the dead, the weight of their sacrifice pressing down on him. "Thank you," Jake said finally, "for believing in me, even when I don't believe in myself." Serath smiled. "That is what allies are for." As the fleet prepared to depart the asteroid field, Liss intercepted a transmission. It was encrypted, sent on a frequency that only the old Empire would have known. When they decoded it, Jake's blood ran cold. It was a message from the Vryn Collective, and it was addressed directly to him. The message was short and to the point. The Vryn Council had been watching. They had seen the battle with the Kaltorians. They had seen Jake's fleet, his tactics, his growing power, and they were making an offer, an alliance. In exchange for recognition of their territories and a seat on a reformed Imperial Council, the Vryn would provide ships, resources, and intelligence. They would help Jake reclaim the throne, but the message ended with a warning. If Jake refused, the Vryn would join the other empires in hunting him down. This was his only chance. Jake read the message 3 times, his mind racing. An alliance with the Vryn would give him a significant advantage, but it would also mean making a deal with one of the empires that had risen from the ashes of his ancestors' fall. It would mean compromising, negotiating, accepting that the galaxy had changed and could never be what it once was. "What will you do?" Varric asked. Jake stared at the message for a long time, and then, slowly, he made his decision. "Send a reply," Jake said. "Tell them I accept, but on one condition." "Which is?" Varric asked. "They meet with me, face to face. I want to look them in the eye and know that they're sincere, because if they're not, this alliance ends before it begins." Varric nodded. "I will relay your terms." As Varric left the bridge, Jake turned to the viewport, staring out at the stars. The battle with the Kaltorians had been his first true test, and he'd survived. But he knew this was just the beginning. The galaxy was waking up to the fact that the heir of Erin had returned, and soon he would face challenges far greater than a single fleet. Empires would rise against him. Assassins would hunt him. Betrayals would test him. But Jake was no longer the frightened mechanic who had stumbled into a tomb and sneezed his way into destiny. He was the heir of Erin, and he would reclaim his throne, no matter the cost. The meeting place was neutral ground, a space station called Terminus Point, located at the convergence of 3 major trade routes. It was old, scarred by centuries of use, and operated by an independent collective that answered to no empire. It was also one of the few places in the galaxy where representatives from rival powers could meet without immediate bloodshed. Jake stood in the docking bay of the Eternal Vigil, adjusting the formal robes that Sarath had insisted he wear. They were deep crimson, embroidered with golden thread in the patterns of the House of Erin, and they felt absurdly heavy compared to his usual mechanic's jumpsuit. The crown sat on his head, no longer hidden, its golden light pulsing softly in time with his heartbeat. He looked like a king, but he still felt like an imposter. "You look the part," Varric said, stepping up beside him. The Kaltorian wore their own formal attire, robes of midnight blue that shimmered with embedded technology. "Now you must act it." "No pressure," Jake muttered. Varric's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "The Vryn delegation will be expecting a warrior, a conqueror, someone who speaks with absolute authority. If you show weakness, they will exploit it." "And if I come across as a tyrant?" Jake asked. "Then they will fear you," Varric said simply, "which may be just as effective." Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself. Behind him, his honor guard stood at attention, 10 warriors from the House of Thalos, their armor polished and their weapons ready. Sarath stood among them, their silver hair braided and adorned with the symbols of their house. "Remember," Sarath said quietly, "you are not just negotiating for yourself. You are negotiating for every human in the galaxy, for the memory of what was, and the hope of what could be." Jake nodded, his jaw set. "Let's go." The interior of Terminus Point was a controlled chaos. Beings from 100 different species moved through the corridors, speaking in languages Jake didn't recognize, conducting business that ranged from legitimate trade to barely concealed smuggling. The air smelled of ozone and exotic spices, and the lighting flickered with the irregularity of a station perpetually on the edge of collapse. The meeting chamber was located in the station's center, a large circular room with a domed ceiling that displayed a holographic projection of the galaxy. A long table dominated the space, already occupied by the Vryn delegation. There were 5 of them, their translucent skin glowing faintly in the dim light. At the center sat High Counselor Erin, an elder whose skin had taken on a faint bluish tint with age, their eyes, large and unblinking, fixed on Jake as he entered. Jake took his seat at the opposite end of the table, his honor guard fanning out behind him. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Finally, Erin spoke, their voice melodic and cold. "Jake Reeves, The lost heir, the mechanic who stumbled into a crown. You have caused quite the disruption. I didn't ask for any of this, Jake said evenly, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Erin leaned forward, their fingers steepled. No. I suppose you are not. You have proven yourself surprisingly resilient. The destruction of Admiral Kaith's fleet was impressive for a human. Jake bit back the retort that rose to his lips. He couldn't afford to let his anger show. You offered an alliance. I'm here to discuss terms. Indeed, Erin said. The Vryn Collective is prepared to recognize your claim to the throne of Erin. In exchange, we ask for 3 things. First, recognition of our current territorial holdings. Second, a permanent seat on any reformed Imperial Council. And third, exclusive trade rights to the Outer Rim sectors. Jake considered the terms. They were generous, almost suspiciously so. The Vryn were one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy. They didn't need to negotiate with him. They could simply join the others in trying to destroy him, unless they saw something he didn't. Why? Jake asked. Why help me? What do you gain from this? Erin smiled, a slow, predatory expression. Stability. The galaxy is on the brink of war. The Kaltorians are mobilizing their fleets. The Kryn are fortifying their borders. The other empires are choosing sides. If this continues, we will tear ourselves apart. But if the heir of Erin returns, if the old order is restored even in a diminished form, it provides a framework, a reason to negotiate rather than fight. You want me to be a figurehead, Jake said quietly. We want you to be a symbol, Erin corrected. A reminder that the galaxy once functioned under a unified rule. Whether you actually wield power or simply exist as a rallying point for humanity, that is up to you. Jake's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. They wanted to use him, to turn him into a puppet that would legitimize their own power, and if he refused, they would destroy him. But he wasn't powerless. Not anymore. I accept your terms, Jake said slowly, with one addition. Erin's expression didn't change, but Jake saw a flicker of interest in their eyes, which is, the Vryn Collective will assist in the liberation of human colonies currently under oppressive rule by other empires, Jake said, starting with the mining colonies in the Kryn Dominion. Those people are living in slavery, treated as disposable labor. If I'm going to be a symbol for humanity, then I need to actually do something for them. Erin was silent for a long moment. Around the table, the other Vryn delegates exchanged glances, their translucent skin flickering with what might have been surprise. You would risk war with the Kryn over a handful of miners? Erin asked. I would risk war over the principle that humans are not disposable, Jake said firmly. If the Vryn Collective truly wants stability, then help me show the galaxy that humanity deserves respect. Not pity, not exploitation. Respect. Erin studied him, their unblinking eyes revealing nothing, and then slowly, they nodded. Very well, we have an agreement. The liberation of the mining colonies took 3 weeks to plan and 2 days to execute. Jake led the assault personally, commanding the Eternal Vigil alongside a Vryn battle group. The Kryn defenders were caught off guard, unprepared for a coordinated attack from 2 former rivals. The colonies were freed with minimal casualties. Jake walked through the settlements, speaking with the miners, listening to their stories of hardship and suffering. They looked at him with awe, with disbelief, with hope, and for the first time since he'd put on the crown, Jake felt like he was doing something that mattered. Word of the liberation spread quickly. Other human colonies began to send messages, asking for help, asking for protection, and slowly the scattered remnants of humanity began to rally around the heir of Erin. But not everyone was pleased. The assassination attempt came on the day Jake returned to the Eternal Vigil, after a diplomatic summit on one of the Vryn core worlds. He was walking through the ship's main corridor, flanked by his honor guard, when the lights went out. In the darkness, Jake heard the hiss of a blade being drawn. He dropped to the floor on instinct, and the blade passed over his head, so close he felt the air displace. His guards reacted instantly, their weapons lighting up the corridor with bursts of plasma fire. The attacker was fast, impossibly so. They moved like a shadow, dodging the guards' shots, striking with precision. 2 guards fell before Jake could even process what was happening. And then the attacker was on him, their blade raised for the killing blow. Jake rolled to the side, his hand closing around a piece of debris, a broken conduit pipe. He swung it wildly, more out of desperation than skill, and by sheer luck, it connected with the attacker's arm. The blade went spinning away into the darkness. The lights flickered back on, and Jake got his first clear look at his would-be killer. They were human. Young, no older than 20, with short-cropped hair and eyes filled with fury. "You're a fraud," the young assassin spat, their voice shaking with rage. "You're no king. You're just another tyrant trying to control us. The ashes of tyranny will never let you restore the empire. We burned it once. We'll burn it again." Jake's blood ran cold. The ashes of tyranny. The conspirators who had destroyed the house of Heir. They still existed. Before Jake could respond, his guards surrounded the assassin, their weapons trained. Serath pushed through the crowd, their expression grim. "The ashes have been hiding for 10,000 years, Serath said quietly, "waiting for the heir to return. They see you as a threat to their ideology. Take them to the brig," Jake ordered, his voice shaking, "and find out how many more of them are out there." As the assassin was dragged away, Jake leaned against the wall, his heart pounding. The ashes of tyranny, the ones who had betrayed his ancestors, they were still out there, still fighting, and they wouldn't stop until he was dead. The interrogation of the assassin revealed the truth. The ashes of tyranny were not a unified organization. They were scattered cells hidden across the galaxy, united only by their belief that the old empire had been corrupt and that its return would doom humanity to repeat the mistakes of the past. Some of them were fanatics. Others were simply terrified of what a restored empire might mean. Jake spent days wrestling with this revelation. Part of him understood their fear. The old empire had fallen for a reason. It had grown arrogant, overreached, forgotten the people it was meant to serve. But he wasn't trying to recreate that empire. He was trying to build something new, something better. "You cannot convince everyone," Varric told him. "Some will always see you as a threat. You must accept that." "I can't just accept it," Jake said. "If I become the tyrant they fear, then they'll have been right all along." "Then do not become that tyrant," Varric said simply. "Rule with wisdom, with compassion. Prove them wrong." 6 months after the crown had chosen him, Jake stood on the bridge of the Eternal Vigil, staring at the view screen. Before him was Erinthar, the dead capital of the old empire. The planet was scarred and blackened, its surface still glowing faintly with residual radiation from the weapon that had destroyed it. But it was still there, still waiting. "We could rebuild it," Serath said quietly, standing beside him. "It would take decades, perhaps centuries, but it could be done. Erinthar could rise again." Jake shook his head. "No, let it remain as it is, a reminder of what was lost, of what we can't afford to repeat." He turned away from the viewport, facing the assembled crew. His fleet had grown to over 300 ships. His allies included the Vryn, several human colonies, and even a few rogue factions from other empires. He had wealth, power, and influence, but more importantly, he had purpose. "We're not going to restore the old empire," Jake said, his voice carrying across the bridge. "We're going to build something new, a confederation, not a dictatorship, a coalition of equals, where humans have a voice, where we're respected, not exploited, where we prove that strength doesn't come from domination, but from cooperation." He paused, looking at the faces around him, humans and aliens, warriors and scholars, people who had once been enemies now standing together. "I was a mechanic," Jake continued. "I fixed broken things, and this galaxy is broken, but I think together we can fix it." Serath smiled. Varric nodded. And across the fleet, from hundreds of ships and thousands of voices, a cheer rose. The heir of Erin had returned, not to conquer, not to rule with an iron fist, but to heal, to unite, to prove that humanity, despite being told they were weak, despite being pushed to the edges of the galaxy, was capable of something extraordinary. Jake Reeves, the mechanic who had sneezed his way into destiny, had become a king, and the galaxy would never be the same. Epilogue. Years later, an old man sat in a workshop on a small station orbiting a human colony. His hands, weathered and scarred from decades of work, moved with practiced ease over a broken engine. Around him, children watched, wide-eyed and curious. "Tell us the story again," one of them said, "about the king who was a mechanic." The old man smiled, setting down his tools. "All right, one more time." It started with a sneeze, and as he spoke, the mark on his chest, now faded with age but still visible, pulsed softly, a reminder of the legacy he carried. The crown was real, the destiny was real, but the man beneath it all, he was still just Jake, a mechanic, a nobody, and that in the end was what made him extraordinary. End.